All right, well, welcome again, everyone. This is part 6 in our 6-part series. So we've made it all the way through. The series is called Listening to Scientists and Our Grandmothers, Wellness at Work. And today's session focuses on food for thought, eating to feel good. So I'm really excited to bring this content to you today. There are other sessions available in the archive. If you haven't watched them, take a look. But really, we're excited to be here today to bring together what we know are evidence-based practices coming out of the science, but also the practical good advice of our elders and our grandmothers in our communities. And so we're going to be talking about both today. And I was inspired by my own grandmother. This is my Nan. Her name is Daphne. In all of my kind of wellness practices, I could kind of link back some of the advice, some of the practices that I saw her demonstrate, not only with me, but for herself. And so that's part of what we're talking about today in terms of bringing ourselves to places of wellness, especially when we're experiencing stress, chronic stress, acute stress. So again, today we're talking about food. I don't know about in your family, but in my family, my Nan always had the best snack drawer. And so I would get things there that weren't necessarily treats in that kind of like sugary way, but they were just somehow more special because they were at Nan's house. And one example is Triscuits. So she always had a box of Triscuits. And that would be like one of the things we could pull out of the snack drawer and have when we went to her house. And I wanted to just check in with you all before we get started and just see what you recall, what you remember as food or snacks or dishes that your grandmothers or elders in your community would share with you. So you can put those in the chat, or if you want to unmute and share your examples. I know there's probably some good ones out there.
My grandmother always had the little butterscotch discs.
Yes.
And the orange slices. Okay. They were like
the chocolate orange ones?
No, these were just orange. It was almost like a gummy to some extent, and they were covered in sugar.
I know those kind, yes. They come in other flavors besides orange.
She always just had orange.
Good for her.
All kinds of cookies, and being a German from Russia, all kinds of Ukrainian or Russian pasta noodles.
Oh, yum.
Of all different kinds.
Anybody else want to share?
Well, my grandma lived in Thailand, so I'd only see her maybe like once a year, once every 2 years. And so she would always just kind of spoil us whenever we got there. So they would just be like just a smorgasbord of food. I mean, there'd be sticky rice, there'd be a meat dish, there'd be egg dishes, there'd be fresh kind of fruits and vegetables. She had a lychee orchard, and so she'd make kind of like lychee jam for us that she liked to put on toast.
That sounds so special.
Lots of great stuff.
Yeah. Yes. So it's part of our tradition, and we're going to talk about how that fits into the broader scope of wellness. Before we dive into that, I did just want to put us back in that context of kind of linking together what the science says with what our grandmothers or our elders in our community told us. So if you've been in the series with us, you know that we have kind of our standard intro. If you haven't seen it yet, we do it slightly differently in each session. So if you want to see different variations of it, watch more sessions. But I just wanted to remind everybody that more than we live in our city or our town, more than we live in our house, more than we live in our car, we live in our body. And at least at the most basic level, that's our common shared experience. Humans trying to be human with health and vitality. And all around us, in the midst of these efforts to be humans living meaningful lives, we find ourselves surrounded by stress. All different kinds of stressors can come into play, and they can come and go and change over time. But one of the things that we're doing to protect our health and our vitality is finding buffers, finding ways to mitigate or protect ourselves against these inevitable stressors. And so what we've been doing in this series is identifying what the science and our grandmothers tell us are some of the most effective ways to buffer against stress. And so we've covered All of these buffers, there are 7 of them. We covered them in 6 different sessions, and today's session focuses on nutrition. And that sounds really fancy. So I want to just start off by saying I'm not a nutritionist, and we are not making any dietary recommendations to treat health conditions or to treat mental health conditions. And we refer you to your personal professionals if that's what you're looking for. Today, we're talking about food, and we're talking about eating food in the context of our own wellness plans, of restoring and investing in our own well-being. And so that's what we'll be talking about today, using a couple of different examples. Let me share our learning objectives. So first off, we're hoping that because you're here in this session, you're going to better understand how the food that we choose impacts our brain and our body. So we'll spend some time talking about that. We're going to talk about how to choose nutrition strategies, eating or food strategies to support ourselves, as well as collectively support our colleagues. And then also think about how caring for our human needs, our basic human needs, can help buffer stress from impacting our health and our mental health, right? So that's our goal for today. And I wanted to just be, again, really clear that when we talk about nutrition, we're not talking about dieting to lose weight. We're not talking about, again, treating any medical conditions or any mental health conditions. And I know, just with that caveat aside, that when we talk about food, it can bring up a lot of things for a lot of people. So before we get started, I wanted to just label a few of them because food can be a really political topic. And so we're not here to say one thing is right or wrong. Your experience with food is your very own. And in my experience, it can be a really personal relationship. Eating itself, food, what you're eating can be a really personal relationship. And so I wanted to just have you all just take a breath and kind of anchor yourself in your relationship with food. And it's probably not one thing, and it probably varies depending on how you're doing, what context you're in, but just maybe pick 3 of these bubbles or create 3 of your own bubbles that kind of describe your relationship with food. I'm not going to ask you to share it because it's personal, but I want you to be grounded in that. So let's just take a pause and think about the 3 things that we feel describe our relationship to eating and to food. All right. And I think the reason that it's important, I will just share one of mine. In my family where that I came from, and then the family that I created, food was love, which can be amazing and also really complicated because sometimes when you say no to food because you're not hungry or because you have a food allergy, then someone in your family may perceive that as you saying no to their love. So again, food can be really complicated. And I want to just be mindful of that. As we're going through this content, I want to give ourselves grace. I want to give ourselves patience if we're feeling things come up, if we're feeling blocked or we're feeling some resistance to some of the information. I would not be surprised. And I want to just hold that in the context that food is complicated. That food is unique and personal to each person. And so the recommendations that you hear, the information that I'm going to share today is just to kind of put it out there and for you to pick up or put down the pieces that are right for you. And again, we did 5 other sessions. So if this one doesn't resonate with you in terms of your wellness planning, I'm sure you'll find something, a strategy, some information in one of the other sessions that's a better fit. All right, so I'm going to start with some aspects of eating that may feel really familiar, and then I want to unpack them. I'm going to unpack them a little bit and just share some really incredible information about how food we eat connects to the experiences, the feelings that we have. So let's start with one popular term that we see, thanks to Snickers, come up more and more in our conversations, and that is the term hangry. Hangry, if you have not heard hangry, it's a combination of the words hungry and angry. And if you have not heard this word before, it probably resonates because all of us have probably felt hangry at one time or another, guilty. And so I wanted to just say, this is a real thing. Let's just start with, if we want to know how food and mood connect to one another, we could start with the basics of hangry. And I just wanted to share some of the background of how this comes about. And as I mentioned, I'm not a nutritionist, but I do draw on what we know, in terms of what the science says, and then we'll tie it back to what our elders say. So let me just share this information about hangry from Dr. Kristen Lindquist, who's at the University of North Carolina. She says, hunger as a state actually causes a lot of shifts in hormones, brain processes, and the peripheral nervous system that are comparable to what we see when we're experiencing anger, fear, and sadness. The reason that we have this in the first place is to help our bodies maintain homeostasis, right? We want to stay in that even-keeled zone. Your brain is always trying to monitor your body and make sure that you're in homeostasis. And if you're not, it sends a signal to the body that we have to shift some things. That shift out of homeostasis into this need of food is experienced as negative, and it triggers a cascade of hormones like cortisol, fight or flight responses, and so on. Ultimately, your body is sending a signal to your brain that things are not good and you need to figure them out. That's my favorite definition of hangry. Your body is sending a signal to your brain that things are not good and you need to figure this out. So that kind of is like a bottom line explanation of how food and mood go together. I definitely feel like it's no surprise now looking back on why grandmothers do offer such good snacks and welcome us with such smorgasbords of delights, because they know if we show up and we're hungry, we're going to be cranky. I want to tie this to some other science that's coming from Stanford Healthcare and Dr. Veronica Santini there. She mentions that glucose, when glucose states are low, it's an indication that people are hungry, and we need glucose, especially our brain, to function properly. The parts of our brains that are associated with hunger, fear, anxiety, and anger is called the limbic system. It starts an automatic response that we have before we even are conscious of it. So our body starts responding before we're even kind of mentally aware of what's going on. It takes that information from the limbic system and from the environment that we're in, and then it modulates these primitive responses. This is another one of my favorite descriptions of hangry. This is why we're not walking around and yelling at everybody, right? Because our brain is kind of taking in these different senses from the limbic system, from the environment, to tell us, is our glucose level modulated? And if it's not, right, if our glucose levels are low, it means that our higher brain functions are not working as well as they could be. So there might be a breakdown in those functions that help us modulate our primitive responses. That is, the mechanisms of self-control over aggression break down. Hence that kind of cranky, hangry, easily triggered loss of control feeling when we're hungry and we can't get our hands on something to eat. So that's hangry, and folks are probably pretty familiar with that. And then I wanted to just kind of connect this for folks who are visual learners. I wanted to put this graphic in here. For folks who are not visual learners, you're like, oh my gosh, Christina, you're flooding me with information. The key thing here is just the bottom. So if you don't want to absorb all of these different connection points, take a look at this bottom text box. So it just kind of bottom lines us that the lower blood glucose levels can make it harder to concentrate and do simple tasks. It can also make it more difficult to behave within socially acceptable norms. Another key takeaway from this graphic is in the top left corner. So when we say glucose, another word that we commonly use for this is sugars. And one of the things that was news to me is sugar. When I think of sugar, I think of candy, I think of sweets, I think of desserts. But I wanted to just be mindful, because we're going to talk about glucose a little bit later on today as well. I want us to be mindful that basically the food that we eat, whether it's sweets or not, breaks down into sugars, right? So when we're eating carbohydrates like rice or noodles or bread, when we're eating fruits, many of these things break down into glucose, as well as other things like amino acids and fatty acids. But I want to focus on how it breaks down into glucose. In this case, we'll just use it synonymously with sugar in our system. And so in this particular case, what we're seeing is kind of the normal, our kind of average consumption of a meal that's naturally going to include foods that break down into sugar within our system. And remember, our brain needs that glucose. That's why eating is important in general. But after a while, right, we've metabolized all of that. And so we don't have it in our system anymore. So you can kind of see that gas tank indicator, right? Our glucose levels start to dip after a period of time between meals. And that's kind of what throws us, our body into that state of thinking, when am I going to eat again? I need these glucose levels to bump back up. So that's, again, kind of a really basic overview of what we're talking about when we're talking about hangry. At a minimum, it's a stress buffer to make sure that we're eating on a consistent basis so that we can keep our glucose levels steady over time instead of these big peaks and drops. And that's what I want to talk about next. I want to talk about the sugar rush and the sugar crash. And I'm gonna spell it out a little bit more, but I wanted to just orient you to the graphic that you're seeing in front of you. So the blue line with this nice steep, steady peak that you'd want to alpine ski right down, that's what your blood glucose looks like after sugar, right? So that's the kind of sugar we're talking about in candy and in ice cream and in cookies and in desserts. You know, any of those kinds of things are going to spike our blood sugar levels right up there, nice steep curve, and then they're going to drop down. We'll talk about why in just a moment. You can see that kind of tan or brown line. That's what happens to our glucose levels after we eat a protein. And then the purple line shows what happens to our glucose levels in our body after eating fat. So you can see there's the food choices that we make are going to impact what's happening with our glucose levels. Now, remember, a lot of times we're talking about sugar as a bad thing. I'm going to say it again because I am just learning all of these things. Sugar is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because we know our brain needs it to function, right? We just heard about that from the scientists at University of North Carolina and from Stanford Healthcare. Our brain needs glucose to function, but it's really about kind of finding that balance. And so candy can be a source of too much sugar. And let's talk a little bit about why. So when we're talking about the sugar rush or the sugar crash, we're referring to what happens when we eat a high amount of concentrated sugars in the form of candy, for example, and then all of a sudden experience something of a energy level drop, right? So if we're eating things like pastas and pizzas, simple carbohydrates, sugars like desserts, we know that our blood level is going to, sugar level is going to spike up. And our body, what it's going to do in response is say like, hey guys, we need more insulin. And insulin, the body again wants to keep things level. So it produces a whole bunch of insulin, which causes the blood glucose level to then drop off very steeply, as you see in our blue line. And that drop off is correlated with drops in energy levels. The fancy word for it is hypoglycemia. We oftentimes call it a sugar crash. I think of it as like the day after Halloween when all of the kids come to school and they are dragging. And when we see some of these kind of characteristics of hunger, irritability, fatigue, discomfort, anxiety, headaches, difficulty concentrating, excessive sweating, jitters, shakiness, dizziness, all of these things that do not factor into our wellness plan, right? That is not, when we think about like, what's going to help me feel good, those are not the characteristics that I'm going after. And so again, depending on certain medical conditions, which I'm not here to advise on, there can be appropriate times to consume sugar and boost insulin levels. But if we're just talking about our general wellness planning, this is some of the kind of evidence behind what our sugar rush, sugar crash experience can be like and how it affects our well-being, how it affects our sense of wellness. Okay, so let's go ahead and move forward and talk about eating for well-being. I'm going to just take a quick pause here and make sure that my battery on my laptop is not going to die. Give me one moment. Okay, eating for well-being. So I want to just make sure we're all on the same page. Again, a lot of this is I have been in the last couple years really investing in this repertoire of content that informs our well-being as adults on campus, supporting the resilience of our young people, right? What tools do we need? What information do I need to understand to support myself, to support my colleagues who are all kind of rallying around young people and students in school? Well, this was also news to me. Clearly, Christina has not been paying close attention to the nutrition field. But what I grew up with as the USDA food pyramid is no longer the food pyramid. So I grew up with this idea that, we have this pyramid of food and we're supposed to eat more of some stuff and less of others. And so that concept has been retired. We now have the food wheel. So that food pyramid where it had 6 to 11 servings of things like bread and pasta, it's a far cry from what is recommended in the food plate or the food wheel. And you can see that on the right side. In this new model from the USDA, we see that almost half of the plate is designed to be filled with things like fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. So very different. Let's take a look at it, kind of a more graphic representation of it. So this is the US food plate. And you can see how it's kind of redistributing where we're getting our wellness, right? Where we're getting our nutrition. And it kind of creates a more, I think, helpful visual guideline of what, if we're looking at a dinner plate, is supposed to be the proportions or the ratios of each thing. And so this is the USDA's version. I do just want to share what I consider the more beautiful version. Canada, wow. This is their food plate. I just think it looks so beautiful that, I felt like I had to use the US one, but I wanted to give a nod to Canada for really doing some beautiful design here. In particular, using the real food so we can see what that looks like. And also showing, I think, using these images of the real food helps us relate to what are the things on this plate that we would eat, because I can tell you I wouldn't eat all of the things on this plate. And then the other piece that I like about it is how colorful it is. And that really is not by accident. It's not like the graphic designer's choice. It's an indication of the distribution of colors that's recommended when we're thinking about eating for wellness. And so I'm just going to let you take that in for another moment because I think it's so lovely. But I want to mention that one of the big differences between plates of pasta and foods such as fruits and vegetables and whole grains is how they impact our brain differently. And so, we can think back to our grandmothers. I don't know if your grandmother said this to you or other adults, but we've all, I think, heard the "you are what you eat" saying. And so if you eat healthy, you feel healthy. If you eat well, you feel well. And I think that it's more than just about our bodies. And so this is the part where I'm going to go a little bit deeper into some of the science behind how there is this connection between what's happening in our brain, which is responsible for the feelings that we feel, the emotional experiences that we're having, and how this connects to and how we consume it. So again, what I want to dive into is this connection between our mental health, so what's going on in our head, and what's going on in our gut. I'm going to take a moment here just to give, oh man, my battery really isn't working. All right, I'm going to pause for one moment, everybody. Give me 1 second. This plug is not a plug. Bear with me. Okay. Oh, really, Sean. Thank you. You guys are the best. Okay, so let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into that scientific connection between what's happening in our head and what's happening in our gut. And I want to talk about kind of these two pieces of the science that are showing up more and more in the research. So one of the kind of lines of research is around inflammation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it might be something that you've already heard about. So this idea that inflammation in our bodies impacts all of these different functionings, both for our physical health and our mental health. And then the other piece of research or line of research that's really coming out is around our bacteria in our gut, or a microbiome. And so just as an example, some of the initial research is finding incredibly strong links between what they call our gut health and our brain function. Now, this really surprised me. So one of the things, if those of you who've heard of the term serotonin, right? Serotonin is one of those chemicals in our brain, or a neurotransmitter that's associated with our mood. And so we hear it in that context quite a bit. But one of the new pieces of information that I learned in the last couple of years is that 90% of that brain chemical is produced in our intestines, so in our gut. And so what we need for our brain to function in a healthy kind of state and for our mood levels, that chemical is actually being produced in our gut and has to do with the levels and types of bacteria there. And then another example in terms of how the bacteria in our gut are impacting our mood is that the research has shown that there is some really strong connections between how a high-fat diet impacts bacteria, which then impacts our sleep and wake cycles. And if you haven't watched the session on sleep, we know that a healthy sleep cycle is really important to our brain functioning and our mood. So again, those are kind of two different lines of research that overlap, really connecting what's happening in our head with our experience of mental health and wellness, our ability to function in a resilient way with what's happening in our gut, with what's happening in the food that we're consuming. So let's take a look at that. Let's see. I'm gonna illustrate this with a video because we'll let the experts explain it to you. Let's see what we have here.
Trillions of bacteria, viruses, and fungi live on or inside of us, and maintaining a good, balanced relationship with them is to our advantage. Together, they form the gut microbiome, a rich ecosystem that performs a variety of functions in our bodies. The bacteria in our guts can break down food the body can't digest, produce important nutrients, regulate the immune system, and protect against harmful germs. We don't yet have the blueprint for exactly which good bacteria a robust gut needs, but we do know that it's important for a healthy microbiome to have a variety of bacterial species. Many factors affect our microbiomes, including our environment, medications like antibiotics, and even whether we were delivered by C-section or not. Diet, too, is emerging as one of the leading influences on the health of our guts. And while we can't control all these factors, we can manipulate the balance of our microbes by paying attention to what we eat. Dietary fiber from foods like fruits, vegetables, nuts, legumes, and whole grains is the best fuel for gut bacteria. When bacteria digest fiber, they produce short-chain fatty acids that nourish the gut barrier, improve immune function, and can help prevent inflammation, which reduces the risk of cancer. And the more fiber you ingest, the more fiber-digesting bacteria colonize your gut. In a recent study, scientists exchanged the regular high-fiber diets of a group of rural South Africans with the high-fat, meat-heavy diets of a group of African Americans. After just 2 weeks on the high-fat, low-fiber, Western-style diet, the rural African group showed increased inflammation of the colon as well as a decrease of butyrate. That's a short-chain fatty acid thought to lower risk of colon cancer. Meanwhile, the group that switched to a high-fiber, low-fat diet had the opposite result. So what goes wrong with our gut bacteria when we eat low-fiber processed foods? Lower fiber means less fuel for the gut bacteria, essentially starving them until they die off. This results in less diversity and hungry bacteria. In fact, some can even start to feed on the mucus lining. We also know that specific foods can affect gut bacteria. In one recent microbiome study, scientists found that fruits, vegetables, tea, coffee, red wine, and dark chocolate were correlated with increased bacterial diversity. These foods contain polyphenols, which are naturally occurring antioxidant compounds. On the other hand, foods high in dairy fat, like whole milk, and sugar-sweetened sodas were correlated with decreased diversity. How food is prepared also matters. Minimally processed, fresh foods generally have more fiber and provide better fuel. So lightly steamed, sautéed, or raw vegetables are typically more beneficial than fried dishes. There are also ways of preparing food that can actually introduce good bacteria, also known as probiotics, into your gut. Fermented foods are teeming with helpful probiotic bacteria like lactobacillus and bifidobacteria. Originally used as a way of preserving foods before the invention of refrigeration, fermentation remains a traditional practice all over the world. Foods like kimchi, sauerkraut, tempeh, and kombucha provide variety and vitality to our diets. Yogurt is another fermented food that can introduce helpful bacteria into our guts. That doesn't necessarily mean that all yogurt is good for us, though. Brands with too much sugar and not enough bacteria may not actually help. These are just general guidelines. More research is needed before we fully understand exactly how any of these foods interact with our microbiomes. We see positive correlations, but the insides of our guts are difficult places to make direct observations. For instance, we don't currently know whether these foods are directly responsible for the changes in diversity, or if something more complicated is happening. While we're only beginning to explore the vast wilderness inside our guts, we already have a glimpse of how crucial our microbiomes are for digestive health. The great news is, we have the power to fire up the bacteria in our bellies. Fill up on fibers, fresh and fermented foods, and you can trust your gut to keep you going strong.
All right. Before we move on, I want to just say, I hope that that's what the microbiome in my gut looks like, all those little characters that we just saw. I also want to pause and give Sharon a chance to talk about sauerkraut recipes in her household, just in case. I've heard stories. So again, just kind of a visual overview, whether it's the video that resonates with you. I'm going to talk a little bit about this graphic in just a moment, but kind of really connecting the dots between what's happening in various parts of our body, in this case in particular, our gastrointestinal system, and how that really links to what's happening in the brain. And so we got that overview. We don't need to remember all of the fancy Latin words, but just remembering that how we're eating is going to impact how we're feeling. And so I want to take a little bit of some extreme examples, right? So here today we're talking about our own wellness and our own resilience, but the researchers are looking at how this information that they're gathering can really impact what we know about nutritional medicine, including around mental illness. And so I want to share a couple of examples here. You can see these kind of linkages here. We have the gut biome with less cute faces at the bottom right in that circle, and really linking to what's happening in the brain when it comes to depression. And the key focus here is on inflammation, right? So what are the factors, right? And when we talk about inflammation, it's our body's immune system kind of reacting as if it's under attack and releasing these chemicals called cytokines, right? That's the cytokines, right? And cytokines is not a fun word to use in everyday speak. So they're just kind of the components of inflammation that our body is releasing because it does believe it's under attack. It's trying to do good work for us. But it's again trying to achieve that homeostasis when for any variety of reasons, whether it's an injury, right? Like we stub our toe or sprain our ankle and it swells up, right? That's inflammation. Or if it's because the foods that we're eating are throwing our systems off kilter, our immune system is gonna see that as an attack and see its job to return things to normal. And the harder it has to work, the more inflammation we're going to see, right? So it's almost counterintuitive because while the inflammation is addressing that specific perceived threat in the body, it's also contributing to harm in our physical health and in our mental health. And so in the case of inflammation or cytokines, we're seeing that that definitely has, according to some of these early research, a connection to some of the neurotransmitters function in the brain. So I'm going to kind of distill it down with just a more simple graphic here and share 3 examples from the research. So one, and again, at the end of this session, you'll have all of the references. So if you want to go back and look specifically at these research studies, they'll be available. But one of the research studies is showing that low levels of certain nutrients, such as folate, magnesium, iron, zinc, and vitamins like B6, B12, and D, are associated with worsening mood, feelings of anxiety, and risk of depression. Right? And so we see that kind of bidirectionality there. In another study, and this ties back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of glucose levels, fluctuations in blood sugar or glucose levels were associated with our mood, in that symptoms of poor blood sugar regulation were, so the symptoms of that, right? So our body not being able to really consistently regulate or keep steady our sugar levels. Those symptoms mirrored mental health symptoms such as irritability, anxiety, and worry. And so again, right, we know that that's not a huge surprise given how glucose is essentially the fuel for brain function. So if our fuel is dysregulated, our brain function is dysregulated. And then the other piece that I wanted to share, which in case the video did not make clear enough, there is at this point a lot of research, a lot of evidence that shows that helpful dietary patterns characterized by eating a lot of fruit, vegetables, whole grains, olive oil, fish, low-fat dairy, and antioxidants, as well as a low amount, so not eating as much of animal foods, those things were associated with a lower risk of depression. So again, depression here is just kind of a symbol, kind of a barometer for how these things can manifest in terms of our wellness or well-being. What we're talking about today is really just our wellness planning on a day-to-day, week-by-week, month-to-month basis. What can we do that we know is going to help our brain function in ways that are going to contribute to our experiencing a sense of wellness and resilience? So why don't we go ahead and shift gears for those of you who are, hopefully you picked up a little bit of the science that is really kind of, I think, groundbreaking in terms of connecting the dots. There are, as I mentioned, resources and references at the end of this session if you want to go deeper, but I wanted to just highlight some of these key findings that are emerging in the field of nutrition, medicine, and mental health. And then I wanted to talk about some of those strategies. So I wanted to tie this back to some of the other tips sheets that we've talked about in other sessions. And just be mindful that not every strategy is going to be a strategy for you. And that is totally fine. We're here to just give you an array and see if you want to try some out and see what works and what doesn't work. And different things may work for you at different times in your life, being mindful of that. The key thing I wanted to share as context when it comes to eating to feel good is that it's not all or nothing. And I wanted to just share a quick anecdote. I had my goddaughter, who's 20 years old, living with me for a few months last year. In my household, apparently compared to the college dorm that she had been in before COVID, the healthy food options are more plentiful, shall we frame it that way. And so she lived with us and she ate with us for a few months. And then once things got a little bit safer, she was socializing again and spending time with some friends. And she came back and she told me this. She said, I'm not going to eat healthy like you do all the time, because then when I go and eat at my friend's house and eat that food, I feel really bad. And I don't want to feel really bad all the time. So I'm just going to eat some bad food consistently so that I have built up my tolerance and it doesn't make me feel so bad after eating it. And she didn't mean guilty bad. She meant physically uncomfortable. And so I just thought that was such a funny thing. She had made some other remarks to me at certain times about not having potato chips in my house, or not having cupcakes on a special occasion. And what I reminded her is that I am not, in my own household, I like to have an abundance of healthy options, but I certainly would, like even last night I had some sour cream and onion potato chips. Like, I am not opposed to finding some balance between what I can eat that helps my resilience and helps me feel good. And then kind of, under other circumstances, making other choices that maybe fall into that category of not so much of this, but I'm not saying it's all or nothing. And so a lot of times, just like when we were talking about the exercise or the movement session on how to use movement and activity, physical activity, as a way to buffer against stress. It doesn't mean you have to join a gym. It doesn't mean you have to run for 5 miles. Even just small movements, small shifts can really contribute to our sense of wellness. And it's the same thing when we think about food and we think about eating. So making sure that you give yourself a break, making sure that you're picking food strategies that feel doable, right? Because the point is being able to do them. They have to be feasible. If you look at a whole bunch of food strategies and you're like, this just does not fit into my life at all, Christina, then it's not going to work. And so thinking about what are the small shifts that you can make, again, thinking about that food plate, maybe we're not going to get that perfect Canadian plate, but maybe we could get closer to it. Or maybe on certain days of the week, we can get closer to it, but not every day of the week. So some of those tips that we think about in terms of eating to feel good, we talked about that it's not all or nothing. We talked about eating in consistent intervals to avoid that hangry effect, right? So having a snack. We talked about getting colorful, right? So having a diversity of different foods that appeal to you. Planning ahead is a big one. And I know a lot of parents have that knack to kind of think ahead for when their young person is going to get hungry. And if you don't have a snack in the glove compartment or in your purse or in that backpack, and your kid is hungry, you are in trouble. Right? So think about it the same way for yourself, whether that's a long commute home from work or a long day on campus, making sure that you have planned ahead of time for how you're going to get access to food, and food that's going to make you feel good, not food that's what you're going to have to eat because that's the only choice. And so again, just also being willing to kind of try new things. I wanted to just put these out there as some of the tips that you can try for yourself. But I also wanted to remind you that oftentimes food is part of our culture. It's part of our tradition. And so when we think about our workplaces and we think about our colleagues at work, how can we eat to feel good in that context? And so just a few suggestions. So thinking about, what do we know about food that's going to help us feel good? And if we're bringing snacks to meetings or trainings, or if we're going to have those things in our office available to colleagues or to students, thinking about what are some of the choices that we could make available based on what we understand about the recommendations for fruits, vegetables, fermented foods, whole grains in particular, and less highly processed foods. And again, I oftentimes, check out what's available at Costco or Fred Meyer in the bulk pack when I'm thinking about what I'm going to bring to a meeting or what I want to have in my office. And there has been a shift away from kind of those snack packs of potato chips and those kind of processed foods. I found the other day at Costco, they have these mini packets of olives. So like individual packets of, whatever it is, 5 to 8 olives to have as a snack. So again, kind of thinking about what are different choices that we can make. And then also thinking about, if we're going from meeting to meeting or training to training, not always having to have food available, right? So if we're thinking about avoiding that sugar rush and that sugar crash, really being mindful that, spiking with a donut in the morning or a lot of cookies that are available during break time at that training can actually be to our detriment. Right? If we know that it's going to make our blood sugar go way up and then crash way down, where within half an hour of eating that, we're going to have difficulty concentrating or feel more irritable. So again, just kind of making intentional choices and being thoughtful about the culture that we're creating in our work communities. Okay, so we're getting to the end of this session, and I wanted to remind you that, as always, our key takeaway is that if you are human, it is okay to take care of yourself by prioritizing eating well to feel good, right? So taking care of you is a priority amongst all of the other things that you have to do. You can't not pour from an empty cup, right? And so making sure that you're filling up your cup before you can go out there and promote the resilience of young people and of colleagues. But we do want to create these cultures of care. We know that investing in your own wellness, in your own resilience, doesn't just benefit you, but benefits all of us, right? All of us around us doing this work. And it also benefits from this idea of it happening in a collective care culture, right? So we want to make sure that we're building this investment in resilience, this investment in self-care as part of a broader scope of investment in collective care, because that's how we're going to see change. That's how we're going to see not just surviving, but thriving. And as we're going through some of these really difficult periods of time, these really prolonged periods of stress, investing in these cultures of care is really going to be to our long-term advantage. So that sums up. Here's our kind of our wheel of evidence-based buffers, not only from our elders and our grandmothers, but scientists are now on board, right? And so take a look at some of the other sessions. Today we were focused on eating or nutrition, but we also have sessions on quality sleep, on supportive relationships, on mindfulness, mental health, access to nature, and physical movement. So these are all different ways that we can make sure we're investing in ourselves, our own health, and our own vitality so that we can go out and live those meaningful lives. And as I mentioned, we do have references for all of the research that we cited here. I'm going to go ahead and stop share and invite folks to go ahead and chime in and see any tips or recommendations that you might have for eating to feel well. You can add to the chat or go ahead and unmute.
I was just gonna add that it's just really helpful to have support. Like if you are wanting to make healthier choices and change, eating choices that are really difficult for you, it's just so important to have some kind of partner or someone to do it with you, to have accountability, encouragement, and rewards in there. So me and my husband are dieting right now. It's really challenging, but we always thank each other every day. I'm like, I'm so glad you're doing this with me, because it'd be really hard to do alone. So.
Oh, that's such a good point. Thanks for sharing that, Vanessa. Yeah, the buddy system is really powerful. Anybody else want to share tips or strategies that they use either for their own eating wellness or collectively in your family, at your workplace?
So I really like to do menu planning. I've been checking out a lot of library books from specifically on like cookbooks, and then just like planning menus around it. So I have I know what ingredients to buy and what I'm going to be making for the week. It's been a lot of fun, and I've gotten to try a lot of new things too.
That's great, Bonica. And I love that. Yeah, making it, into something that appeals to you, where you can kind of explore and have adventures with new foods, and really kind of approach it with an intention. I will share an example of what my daughter does, who does not want to spend a lot of time meal planning, but she still wants to eat well to feel well, which is she does that meal prep work. So she spends her Sundays like roasting a cookie tray full of butternut squash, so that it's already prepared and she can have it during the week as a side dish, or she could blend it into a butternut squash soup, so that she has some of those kind of core pieces. I know she does the same thing with like cauliflower rice. She'll prepare a bunch of those kinds of healthy sides that can be translated into different meals across the course of the week. And gives her kind of like a head start, so that it's not starting every dinner with a what am I going to make tonight type of approach. And that's her shortcut to healthy eating.
Hi, this is Velda. I logged on half an hour late, but in our family, we keep our freezer full of salmon and moose and subsistence foods so that when it's time to cook, we have fish or lean meats, moose with our meals. And then I grow a hydroponic garden. Hydroponic garden, and I have a 30 pod with all kinds of greens and herbs, and I grow my own celery, and
Wow.
yeah, so just a assortment of vegetables, and I've been doing that for 2 years.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Velda, for sharing that. And yeah, I think again, it's kind of looking around and seeing what fits into your life, into your family, into your culture. And so as we mentioned, food can be complicated, or we can uncomplicate it and just work with what we have to line up with what we know is going to contribute to our experience of wellness. So I want to thank everybody today. I want to thank Deed and Sharon for hosting us for this series. Again, we have some of those sessions archived for you, and we're looking forward to bringing you new topics on wellness as we roll through 2022. And we'll be announcing those shortly. But again, thank you very much for being here today. And we'll look forward to more sessions with you in the future. Sharon,